Okay, so we'll get started. Welcome on board, everyone. Thank you for joining us from far and wide. I'm here in New Zealand. I know some of you are either New Zealanders abroad or New Zealanders in New Zealand, and other people are spread all around the world. Thanks for getting back there, Barry. Welcome from Palmerston North. So, my name is Ray Boardman. I've been a professional triathlon and cycling coach for a number of years now. I started my business, what was originally Ray's Independent Fitness Consultants, back in February 2000, and have since rebranded to Qwik Kiwi Coaching, and I've been using that term since 2002. As an athlete, I'm primarily a triathlete, but I take part in a number of cycling events throughout New Zealand. I've done the Lake Taupo Cycle Challenge, which is a century ride or a 160 kilometre, 100-mile event. Able Tasman Cycle Challenge based out of Nelson. I did that a couple of times. Unfortunately, that hasn't been held in recent years, as well as Grape Ride in Marlborough. I've done both Ironman Taupo and Challenge Wanaka back when it was a full iron distance event. Done them a total of 6 times and done many other events. I've coached a range of athletes, but specialise in coaching beginner and recreational athletes. And I've coached plenty of people to finish the first half Ironmans, as well as qualify at either Kona for Ironman events, or to get through to Roth in Germany for the challenge events. So that is a little bit about myself. I don't just ride road or time trial bikes. I also love getting out on my mountain bike, exploring trails and going on new adventures, and also participating in mountain biking events and adventure races. All right. So today we're going to be covering a few things, but a number of you replied to either an ad on Facebook or a promotion via email where I talked about, I was going to share a few things with you. Number one training secret to enhance your FTP, as well as my number one workout for improving your FTP. For those that are new to the cycling terminology, you may not be familiar with FTP, but it is reasonably common in cycling fraternity these days. It doesn't say anything about people that are in the police force. It refers to your functional threshold power, and that is a key significant metric to determine your capability. And as an athlete, to enhance your performance, effectively any improvement in your FTP and or your Vo2 Max is going to translate to improved performance in most events. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So that was the big draw card for what a number of you probably came on here to see. But I'm also going to talk through a number of things around training intensity and how I periodize training programs. And I'll also take you through some of the numbers that some athletes I coach went through to to boost or improve the FTP by over 10% in just 4 weeks. So the most important thing, more so than what your FTP is your consistency of training. And a lot of that comes down to how often you are training. So people that train consistently and train regularly are typically going to improve their results more than people that train sporadically. So if you're just getting out for a couple of weekend rides, maybe a group ride on the Sunday and a mountain bike ride on the Saturday, you'll probably be able to keep up with that environment, but not make any significant improvements going forward. You will need to increase the frequency of your training. A minimum of 3 times a week is typically what I recommend, but if you are training 3 times a week cycling, I do encourage people to do other forms of cross training as well. There's a lot of things that provide benefit, and so effectively doing something every day is going to be the key to generate really good improvements. Now, what you do each day doesn't need to be cycling, but it's certainly, if you're focusing on cycling and wanting to improve your FTP, riding sort of 4 to 6 times a week is going to get you some really good results. And we'll look at that in terms of breaking that down a bit more. So daily training, the 30 minutes minimum that I mentioned, there's a number of ways we can do this. We can do 3 rides, 3 cross training sessions, and a flexibility training session. So we're doing something every single day. Now, whether that cross training, maybe you're a triathlete, and including swimming or running in there as well, or maybe you're just including some form of cross training as overall fitness and health, well-being type activity. Another way of breaking it down is going from 3 to 4 rides per week, cutting down a couple of a day of cross training and increasing the flexibility, or not increasing it, sorry, we're keeping that at 1. And then if we were to increase up to 5 rides, we can probably cut out that cross training, because it's very clear that you want to focus on your cycling as your key sport or activity, but also having those couple of flexibility training sessions in there to help enhance recovery, decrease the risk of injury, and continue to move forward and improve. So the more frequent you're training, the greater the results are going to be. And getting out and doing something regularly is the key determinant that is going to enhance your cycling and boost your FTP. But not solely. You're going to have to train at the appropriate training intensity to get those results. And to set and develop that training, you're going to need to have accurate and regular FTP testing. There's a couple of ways you can do that testing, and I'll cover that shortly, but primarily the ramp test used by Zwift and or Trainer Road, but my preference is the 20-minute FTP test. Now, yes, I do know it takes a little bit longer to do, it hurts a bit more, pacing's a bit more challenging, but by doing it on a regular basis, sort of every 4 to 6 weeks, you're going to get better at improving that pacing. If you're looking to improve your FTP, FTP is based around your steady state ability to maintain an intensity for 60 minutes. So we do the 20-minute test replicates that a lot better than a ramp test that takes you up to your maximum that you can sustain for 60 seconds and makes the assumption that 75% of that is what you can hold. Yes, I do acknowledge that the 20-minute test makes the assumption that 95% of that wattage is what you can hold for an hour, but the 20-minute replicates that hour a lot better than 1 minute does. So let's have a look at what these include. So the 20-minute FTP test, got to have a thorough warm-up. And sort of 10 to 20 minutes riding to start with, some higher intensity, 60-second efforts there to build the heart rate, 5 minutes max effort, a good recovery, and then getting in and riding for 20 minutes as hard as possible. Like I touched on previously, FTP is 95% of that power that you can sustain for those 20 minutes. So you take that average wattage from the 20 minutes and multiply by 0.95, and it's going to give you a FTP figure that is based on what you can probably hold for that 60 minutes. Now that short link there, if you were to type that in, that would take you to my website and give you a thorough breakdown and description of how to do the 20-minute FTP test. Now the alternative is doing a ramp test, and the advantage of the ramp test is that you don't need to pace your effort for 20 minutes. What usually happens for people doing the full 20 minutes FTP test, their power starts off reasonably, well, not reasonably high, a little bit higher than what it will be. It drops down and then picks up again towards the end. Now with the ramp test, constantly building the intensity and building on that, adding a little bit more intensity every 60 seconds. For most people, unless you're either new to cycling or weigh less than 60 kilograms or 122 pounds, you'd start at 100 watts. Those of you that are under 60 kilograms would start at 50 watts. You're then going to increase 20 watts every 60 seconds, or 10 watts if you're below that 60 kg or brand new to cycling, and building up from that. You just keep riding, sustaining that effort until such point that it is too much and you can't hold it anymore, and your best minute of power from the ramp test, 75% of that is going to be very close to your FTP. The advantage of this workout is that it is over relatively quickly and can be repeated more frequently. I've just seen your question there, Steve. Yeah, I'll give an opportunity to answer questions at the end. So feel free to type them in the question box, either yourself or anyone else who's got questions. Just type them in. I might cover them during the presentation, but I'll go through any questions that are in the box at the end and also give you an opportunity to answer them at the end. So that's the ramp test and the 20-minute FTP test. Now, my preference is for the 20-minute FTP test, and the reason for that, as I said before, is that you are going to develop your pacing skills. And most of the athletes I coach are triathletes and or time trialists or mountain bikers that are doing longer events. So steady state effort is the key. If you were doing or needed to do repeated testing on a regular basis for a reason, then I'd probably drift to the ramp test. And I'm also aware that plenty of coaches recommend the ramp test due to the fact that pacing isn't required, but because pacing is an important consideration for most athletes I coach, that is the reason I have that as my preferred test. So we take these FTP figures we've generated and we can calculate some training zones. Now, I keep things relatively simple. I just use 5 different levels with my athletes. I know there's coaches out there that only use 3, some use 7, some use 8, some use 10, different zones or levels. I use 5, keep it relatively simple. And the percentage of the FTP I use is based on Hunter Allen and Andrew Kogan's methodology. I am aware that they do have anaerobic capacity and a neuromuscular zones above that. But because most of my athletes, like I said before, are steady state athletes, I don't use them. I don't train any track cyclists. And at the elite or professional level of cycling or short intense track events, that's when those zones become more critical and get utilized in training. So I don't use them as a general rule. I do sometimes use them for some particular athletes in certain circumstances. But as a majority, I just use the 5 zones or 5 levels, as I refer to them, laid out there. Level 1 is a recovery zone, and that's where your percentage of FTP is below 55%. And I've just put examples there for someone who's got a 250 watt FTP. So that'll be less than 137 watts. They'll be cruising along. They'll be able to maintain a conversation with any training partners, and they're not going to get out of breath whilst they do so. As we build the intensity a little bit, move up to 56 to 76% of the FTP, my level 2 intensity, you're working on endurance, you're improving the efficiency of the heart and lungs, getting the ability for the body to draw air into the lungs, absorb the oxygen from that, and transport that to the working muscles that require it. So we're going to get good improvements of that at that intensity. And for that hypothetical person with a 250 watt FTP, that's between 138 and 190 watts. At that intensity, they'll be able to ride along, they'd still have a conversation, they'd talk with sentences, catching their breath in between whilst talking to their training partner. As we step up the intensity, they're not going to be able to speak so easily. So it's a level 3 intensity, working on tempo, 76 to 90%, or for our hypothetical person there, 191 to 225 watts. This intensity, sentences would be shorter, they'd catch their breath in between. For the triathletes listening in, this is the sort of intensity that you would ride the bulk of a half Ironman event at. As we step through to level 4, threshold intensity, that's now sitting right over your FTP, between 91 and 105% of that effort. The example, we're now up 226 to 262 watts. And as we go above that again, no longer going to be able to talk clearly. 2 or 3 words is going to be the absolute max. Lots of sucking in oxygen. Now that we're above 106%, working at our Vo2 Max. Just see a question there from Kirsty. Can these FTP figure zones be easily translated to heart rate? Yes, they can. So same sort of deal. I've just lost my presentation there. It's gone on the other screen. Let's see if I can bring it back that way. There we go. The percentages don't directly relate, but obviously as we build intensity, heart rate is going to increase, the same as the amount of power generated. The difference between power and heart rate is that heart rate is your body's response to exercise, whereas power is the intensity. The heart, or the body's physiological response to that intensity, is to increase the heart rate to deliver more oxygen to the muscles. So there's always going to be a lag in heart rate. I'm taking it based on that question, Kirsty, that you don't have a power meter or don't always have an access to it. So someone who is using a smart bike connected to Zwift or Trainer Road or something, when they go ride on the road, don't have a power meter necessarily attached to their bike. I do have a couple of articles on my website talking about differences between power and heart rate and how I do the comparisons between them. Seem to have a few questions coming in, so I'll answer them now before moving on. Have you experienced athletes whose performance somewhat plateaus using the traditional targeted threshold interval model? If so, what are your thoughts on the polarized? I'll get into my periodization shortly, Steve, and I'll come back to that if it doesn't answer your question for you. And Kirsty, I see you've only got heart rate. So you can certainly, the percentages are different, and there's a number of different methodologies out there in relation to that. That's a whole different webinar that if there's some interest, I might look at doing that, but I can certainly flick you an email later and direct you to some articles on my website. And next question there, if athlete trains without power, would you recommend heart rate versus RPE for training zones? Yeah, I definitely do recommend using some measure of intensity over pure subjective measures. One of the downsides of heart rate, though, is it can be influenced by a number of factors, including how well hydrated you are. And on that note, I'm going to take a quick sip of water. Types of stimulants that you may have consumed that morning, i.e. coffee, and a range of other factors such as how well fueled your body is, combinations of fuels you've consumed, as in fats to carbs, those sort of things, how stressed, how fatigued, how tired you are, all play a role in the heart rate response. So it's not the be all and end all, but it is better than absolutely nothing. All right, so my periodized approach to training is a little bit different from some. This is based off an American running coach whose name is Jack Daniels. He does hold a PhD in exercise physiology. and nothing to do with the bourbon that's produced in Kentucky. So my approach that I translate across to triathlon and cycling and other endurance events is based around 4 phases. They do closely represent a traditional base then build phase that the likes of Joe Friel have popularized. And Jack Daniels' 4 phases start off with the foundation injury prevention phase, or known as the FI phase, and moves through the early quality phase, transition quality phase, and then the final quality phase. And I'll work through them, but not necessarily in order. So starting with the foundation injury prevention phase, this is where we start the base building for the season. The whole idea is to improve the efficiency of the heart and lungs, develop that ability to absorb the oxygen from the air and transport that to the working muscles. The majority of the training in this phase is mainly at level 2. And one of the key outcomes is preparing the body for the training that will follow in the next 3 phases. But the big thing there is developing that aerobic base that we can build the other intensities on. We're not going to build it fully in the first phase, and that will continue through the following phases. So as we move into the early quality phase, like I said, we continue to build on the fitness and build that aerobic base as we work through this phase. But we're also introducing some higher intensity work through hill reps and low cadence big gear efforts to develop that on the bike strength training. This can support and supplement or be supplemented by gym-based strength training. And I'm not going to focus on the gym-based strength training in this webinar, but the high cadence big gear efforts and the hill reps, you're all working against a greater resistance, whether that resistance is applied by the hills or by the selection of gear requiring greater force to turn those pedals. So those are the key focus areas, if you'd like, that I include in this phase. I'm going to jump over the transition quality phase for now, and I'll come back to it, and hopefully you see why in a second. So the final quality phase, it's the most specific phase. As we get closer and closer to the event, we want the training to replicate that event, not necessarily every session, but we do want to have sessions that target the particular intensity and terrain of a set event. While during all these phases for any endurance sport, we're going to continue to build the fitness and maintain, as well as try and further develop the aerobic system. So the intensity we want to match the event in this final phase. If we're looking at a century ride, there's going to be more of a focus on the lower intensity effort or intensity at the tempo and or endurance end of the spectrum. We're contrasting that to someone doing a 20-kilometer cycle ride in a sprint triathlon. The focus is going to be more at the higher end, the Vo2 Max and threshold capabilities of that athlete. So we're maximizing that intensity, the race-like intensity, as much as we can. We're using that lower level 2 intensity to assist with recovery and also to maintain the aerobic system. If we've got the opportunity to develop that, we will, but it's all going to depend on how much recovery this athlete needs from those higher intensity efforts and also the overall training load. So if I jump back to the transition quality phase now, the purposes of this is to continue to build and maintain further that aerobic system, and we're going to look at about 80%, and that applies in both the early quality and the final quality phase as well. About 80% of the training is going to be based around that intensity, with 20% coming from the higher intensities. Now, transition quality, we're moving from or transitioning from the early quality phase to the final quality phase. So if we're depending on the type of training or the type of event that the athlete is looking at preparing for, we're going from those hill reps and big gear efforts to either Vo2 Max at the higher end of things for shorter distance events, or events that are going to take a shorter duration. And we're going to be including more threshold or tempo efforts before moving on to the Vo2 Max efforts in the final quality. At the other end of the spectrum, for someone doing a century ride or a longer, more endurance-orientated ride, we're going to be looking at working at the threshold tempo intensity in the final quality. So this is our opportunity to include a Vo2 Max efforts within this block of training to basically build that top end. So that is a rough layout of how I structure things going forward as an overview. Now, looking at the duration involved, if someone's got a longer term approach, i.e. longer than 12 weeks, we're going to want to have to maximize our time in the appropriate phases of that training. The lasting up to 6 weeks each. I don't like going longer than a 24-week build-up. The goal, the event, the target is just too far in the distance. The light at the end of the tunnel is rather small. So I'll often break up a longer build-up into 2 or maybe even 3 build-ups with stepping stones or sub-goals along the way. If event-wise, we may look at something building up to it, whether it's an event online in the Zwift world or one of the other virtual training or racing platforms, and then building through to the real world event. And some athletes are just these days racing and training effectively exclusively in the virtual world, and that's fine as well. As we work through, we have FTP testing at the start of each phase, and especially when they're up to 6 weeks long, it's quite a good spacing for it, especially with my preference for the 20-minute FTP test. Particularly in the final 2 phases, we'll include some form of racing, whether on-road. And when I say on-road, I mean in the real world. Mountain bikers obviously don't do much or don't necessarily do all their racing on the road. So particularly in those last 2 phases, that's our opportunity. Racing gives us the opportunity to test nutrition and other, particularly race tactics and strategies. For something where it's not 16 weeks or 20 weeks or 24 weeks, where it's a 4, 5 or 6 week split, I'll put the focus on areas or phases so we can develop the weaknesses in that. If the athlete struggles in the hills, we'll probably put more of a focus on the early quality phase to develop that hill climbing ability, and put less where they've got a strength within their physiological profile. Where there's a bit more of a medium-term approach between sort of 5 and 12 weeks, we'll shorten the phases and or skip phases completely, particularly when someone is quite strong in an aspect. Just using that example before, where someone is a strong hill climber, then we will effectively skip the early quality phase and move, or have it relatively short and move quickly from the foundation injury prevention phase into the transition quality. We may not have FTP testing at the start of each phase. Sometimes we'll make sure that there's at least 4 weeks between testing. There's not much to be gained by testing 2 weeks after doing an FTP test. There will be something to gain by including ramp tests a little bit more frequently, and depending on the athlete, depending on the goals, depending on how things are coming on, we might do that as a stopgap measure, and often we won't worry about it through 2 phases and then do it at the start of the transition quality phase. And once again, include racing both on road or the real world and Zwift, particularly towards the end of the build up. Miss it out of the initial half roughly and build it in to the second half. If it's shorter than that, effectively we're just going to develop training that's going to be quite intense, lots of intervals and or racing. Where we're including racing, we don't necessarily include a large amount of intervals. Looking around that sort of, I do put a higher percentage of intensity work, particularly if it's a very short term, 2 to 3 weeks. I'll increase the amount of intervals in there, sometimes going as close to 50% in terms of intensities, but bearing in mind that this is for a very short-term process, and then have a really good focus on recovery after that. So it's effectively crash training, a big block of training, a big block of intense training, recover from it, and then you get some really good results out the other end. But this isn't normally recommended. My preferred method is to have a good build up over a period of time. Generated some interesting results and looking at stuff for athletes last year when seasons sort of got blown out a little bit, and all of a sudden they wanted to be involved in the virtual Ironman world or get involved a lot more heavily with Zwift. We did some pretty nifty things in terms of playing around with people's training, making some sudden and drastic changes to their goals, and developing training to generate some short-term results for them. So, workouts. This is there are no secrets here. I publish workouts on my website every single week. Every Wednesday, cycling workout gets loaded up, as well as swimming and running workouts and on other days of the week. My secret sauce is how the workouts combine to generate success, and that's what I'm giving you a bit of in this webinar. So if you're after workouts, there are plenty on my website. Just go to www.coachray.nz, and yeah, on the front page you'll find a cycling workout. You'll probably find plenty of running and swimming workouts as well. Click on the cycle, or you can even just, on the right hand side, there's a drop down menu for categories. Just go to that and choose cycling workouts and you'll get hundreds. Been publishing a weekly workout since 2015. So what's that? That's close to 300, 400, not 400 yet, but over 300 these days, I believe. So go and have a good look through there. A range of workouts for a range of things. But in terms of the crux behind them, endurance workouts, level 2 riding, building up that duration. Shorter workouts at that intensity for recovery. For lower intensity efforts, I don't believe, yes, there's good recovery benefits from it, but we might as well get some aerobic development by riding at level 2. You're not going to leave yourself too fatigued unless you're right on the absolute limit already. Strength workouts, we'll do these at level 5 by doing hills, going for short durations, and big gear low cadence efforts are typically level 3, sometimes level 4, and they're of a longer duration. Threshold efforts at level 4 and Vo2 Max efforts at level 5. Let's have a look at some of these in detail. So endurance workouts, as I touched on, level 2. Typically the cadence is high and the resistance and force required to turn the pedals is low. They're reasonably long duration and build them progressively as we work through the program. If someone has never done a 3-hour ride or never gone over an hour, sending them out for a 3-hour ride is going to leave them very, very tired, very fatigued. So we build that progressively from where they're currently at and develop that endurance over time. Shorter duration, as I touched on before, for recovery. The strength workouts, hill reps, you generate the resistance from the hill by working against gravity. Typically, these are going to be a higher power or higher intensity, a level 5 effort for the hill reps. Typically, you can go ride a hill at any intensity you want, you just go slower. But we're wanting to generate the strength in the leg muscles. We can do them seated, we can do them standing up, we can do them combination. One of my favorite hill rep sessions is a 8 by 90 seconds. The first 60 seconds is seated, and then you change to a higher gear, stand up, and power through the last 30 seconds before turning around and descending to recover and repeating a total of 8 reps. I've used an example here of 5 by 3 minutes uphill, 3 minutes descending downhill at level 2. You can do this on a wind trainer or on Zwift, in terms of that level 2 effectively being flat. In Zwift, it's not as simple to just go up and down a hill as you would in the real world. But setting those workouts within Zwift and following them is a great way of doing them at appropriate intensities. Looking at big gear, low cadence efforts, the resistance for these, instead of coming from working against gravity, it's working to overcome the gearing that you've selected. So you need to make sure you put it in a high gear, which forces your that's no pun intended there. The force generated by turning at the slower pace is going to work with different muscle fiber types and generate a different adaptation again. So we're looking at moderate power here, level 3, maybe up into level 4. And the example workout there is one I posted, a couple I posted a couple of weeks ago actually, one from Triathlon Taryn and one from What's on Zwift. But they're both effectively 9 by 4 minutes at level 3 with a cadence of 60 to 70 RPM with only a 2-minute rest between. Because we're at that lower intensity, we don't need as much rest. For that rest interval, I would encourage people to spin at a lot higher cadence, just to help flush a few things, particularly lactic acid, if any is built up, help clear that from the muscles so that the next 4-minute effort, you are starting with as clear legs as possible. So that's some strength workouts there. Threshold workouts, you're riding close to your FTP, either just above or just below. It's very specific to enhancing your functional threshold power. One of my favorites here is the quad crusher. If you search quad crusher on my website, you'll come across a series of workouts I've developed, 5 of them. But the first one, the quad crusher 1, is 3 by 10 minutes at level 4. But every 2 minutes through that 10-minute period, you stand and attack for 12 to 15 pedal strokes. Sit back down and settle straight back into that level 4. Between those 3 reps, take 10 minutes at level 2, just spin the legs out, recover. And that is a great session. I can assure you, if you go out and do that, you'll see why it is called quad crusher. Let's look at Vo2 Max workouts now. They are high intensity, level 5. They're designed to boost your Vo2 Max. An example here is 3 sets of 5 repetitions and 90 seconds at level 5, then 90 seconds recovery at level 2. Once you've done those 5 reps, take 5 minutes rest interval between sets and repeat that until you've completed the 3 sets. Any questions at this point? Okay, nothing further is showing up in terms of question-wise at this point. So we'll quickly move on. If you're busy writing a question, feel free to continue doing so. But I just want to talk about quickly about what I did to boost my athletes' FTP by about 10% in 28 days. And I've got some examples there in terms of an athlete that took their FTP from 248 watts to 278 during the 28-day challenge. Now, it's not quite right. It was day 1 of the challenge was an FTP test, and then at the end of the challenge, so after the 28-day mark, and I'm pretty certain these 4 here all did it on day 29, is doing another FTP test. And this was all 20-minute tests. So they went from 248 to 278 and improved by 12%. Another athlete, 178 through to 205. That was the biggest jump. Arguably, they did have a bit more to gain by having the FTP at the lower end of the range. But then there's a couple of athletes there, 303 up to 324 for a 7% improvement, and 294 to 312 watts for a 6% improvement. The 28-day challenge is designed to fit around people's current ability. So I used the example before of if someone has never ridden for more than an hour, sending them for a 3-hour ride is going to be quite fatiguing and quite draining for them. So everything's based around where you're currently at with your cycling, what you've done in the last sort of 6 to 8 weeks, and building from there to develop things further. The 28-day challenge, I guarantee you'll improve your FTP or you'll get your money back. Now, normally I charge $347 a month for coaching, but for today, I'm doing the 28-day challenge for only $97 to get on board and do that challenge. At the end of that challenge, if you want to talk about ongoing or further coaching, then we can look at different options for you at that. So if you do want further information or want to sign up and get on board, go to qwikkiwi.com/sign-up, faster-cycling-28-day-challenge, and that will take you to the sign up. To make it easy, I'll send an email out after this and include that link and some basic details. So now's the time that I'll go through and answer all your questions. So I take it, Steve, that when I talked about how I periodize things, that has answered your question. I see we've had a few people join up while I was taking the webinar, so feel free to just type into the question box, let me know where you are from and what you're currently training for. Hey Luke, are you doing the 70.3 next, not this coming weekend, but the one after, or are you looking at the one at the end of the year and then going on to Ironman? When you say cycle racing, are you talking Tour of Southland type events, or are you more local club racing? And do you have any particular questions arising from the webinar as well in terms of how that can be implemented within your training? Kirsty, you and I are very much alike. I much prefer to be outside, although I'm also a numbers geek and realize that generating consistent numbers is done pretty well on the indoor trainer. I wouldn't necessarily say missing a trick. It definitely makes things a little bit easier, particularly as the weather turns for winter. You've got the advantage that it's turning to summer for you at the moment. Investing in a wind trainer is an absolutely fantastic tool. I wouldn't be without it, but like I said, my preference is also to get outdoors, and I'd much rather get out into the hills on the mountain bike on a wet, muddy day. Mud equals fun in my life, so I do enjoy that. I don't enjoy cleaning the bike afterwards, of course. You can get set up on a wind trainer nice and easily. You don't need to connect to Zwift or anything like that, but you can easily use some Garmin sensors to easily use a dumb trainer to connect to Zwift. If you've got a bit of money, a smart trainer makes things nice and smooth and generates some really good data, but it also gives you power data for your training. You can focus on that and then use heart rate out on the road, out in the hills on the mountain bike, if that was the way you wanted to go, and depending on the budget available, of course, as well. I don't have any particular recommendations for different smart trainers or even just regular wind trainers. In terms of the smart trainer side of things, if you go to dcrainmaker.com, there's an American guy from DC, but he's now living in the Netherlands, that does some pretty good, sometimes brutally honest reviews of sports technology around the cycling and triathlon world, of which smart trainers is a key area he focuses on. So go to his website and have a read on some stuff in there. Hey Luke, yeah, 70.3 at the end of the year. I assume you're looking at doing Ironman either later that season in 2022, or maybe the season after. In terms of talking about diet and nutrition, outside of the scope of this webinar, carbs do provide a really good fuel source. Having said that, fat does too. Having said that, the intensity that you burn fat at is a lot lower than carbs. So you're always going to be limited to a certain extent then. Having said that, adaptation means that you can increase the limit there, but it's still always going to be lower than the intensity that you burn carbs at. So there are some limitations to it, although there are some athletes getting some really good results. And I'll leave it at that for this webinar. That's something for a future webinar maybe, but I'd really recommend, particularly if you are interested in the higher fat, low carb type stuff, Mickey Villenden, who is a nutritionist who specializes in that. I might flick an email out with those details to everyone. I'll write a quick note to do that. All right, any other questions? Hey, no problems at all, Luke. You're very welcome. If there's no further questions coming through, I'll wrap things up. I will stay on the line for a few more minutes in case someone does have something they do want to ask. Appreciate you all spending your time listening and watching my presentation. If you do have any questions, feel free to write them in the question box now. But if something comes to mind in the future, feel free to touch base with me via social media or give me an email. Hey, Kirsty, no problems at all. You're more than welcome. Stay safe over there from the COVID and train well. And if you do, like I said, if you've got questions, and the same goes to everyone else, feel free to reach out via social media or drop me an email. Yes, good night to you. Thanks, everyone. I'll wrap things up here. Those of you still on the line, if you do have a question, feel free to drop me an email, reach out via social media, either Instagram, coach_Ray_NZ, or Facebook, Coach Ray, Qwik Kiwi Coaching. And yeah, all the best with your writing.